What is up guys, this is Locke, YGO, and welcome back to the channel. And today guys, I'm bringing you a little bit of a different kind of video, that being speed duel cards that you can play in almost every deck that are actually pretty generic and almost every deck can make good use of them. And we start with the monsters, those being Jinzo. This guy is basically great because every trap is negated. Great thing about this is that you can actually build your deck taking that into account and then minimize the amount of traps you're playing to just a little or none at all. Next we have Diddy Crow. It's Graveyard Disruption, it's great in TCG, it's also insane in Speed Duel because you can actually stop one of their most important plays and end their whole turn with this. Next, speaking of Graveyard Control, we play Kaiko and Shosai for mostly the same reasons. This allows you to control your opponent's monsters in the graveyard. When you inflict damage you banish them, and Shosai gets rid of one of their spell and traps when he's sent to the graveyard. Next we got Sphere Kuribo. It's just a generic hand trap, and hand traps are actually pretty good in speed duels if they have some kind of impact, and stuff like Sphere Kuribo, your opponent might be expecting it, but there's not much he can do to stop it. We also have Diddy Warrior Lady, which is great monster control because your opponent cannot do usually anything towards her except getting their monster destroyed, especially if you set her face down. They will not know what it might be, and when you flip up Diddy Warrior Lady you can just choose to banish her and the opponent's monster, leaving them open. Moving on, speaking of monster control, you can also run stuff like Exiled Force or Exploder Dragon. These are generic earth targets that can be brought from your deck with Giant Rat. Keep in mind I'm not showing her here because I don't think she's that much of a generic card, but these guys can be brought with Giant Rat and they will essentially do the same, that is getting rid of your opponent's annoying monsters that you need to get rid of. And speaking of getting rid of the opponent's monsters, we also have Drillroid, which essentially does the same, but it's against defense position monsters. Also, on the same topic, we can also make use of Lava Golem to tribute off two of their monsters and put this guy into their field, and if you manage to keep him around, every turn your opponent will lose 1000 life points during their standby phase. Now we move on into the spell and trap removal as well. We have Absorbing Jar. This card is great in very aggressive decks, in the sense that you set her, and then if your opponent attacks it, since there's no win phase 2, they'll have to set the spell or traps, and you flip it face up and activate its effect, which will get rid of all of their back row, and then leaving them open to an OTK on the next following turn that you have. Also on the spell trap removal, we have Breaker and Destructotron. These guys do basically the same, but in different ways. So Breaker remains on the field most of the time, but can only get rid of one of their spell and traps, but Destructotron allows you to get rid of as many as you need in exchange for 1000 LP and the fact that he will die in the end phase if you don't control any other psychic type monster, which is always, let's be real. And to finish off the monsters, we have Vortex Trooper. This is just a generic consistent card that allows you to dig your deck for the stuff you need and put back the stuff you don't need, making it for a great addition for any deck that doesn't really need a normal summon. And that's all for the monsters guys, and now we move on into the spell traps. And the first spell trap is Super Polymerization. It's not very popular in this format, but with the addition of the new hero monsters, this card is actually seeing a little bit more play and has potential to in the future become an amazing card like it is in the TCG. Next, we also have Creature Swap, which is a great card overall and has some niche uses in a way that if your opponent has stuff like Gear Free the Iron Knight with Iron Grit, which is unaffected by card effects, you can actually still get control of it to your side of the field if your opponent has no more monsters, because cards like Creature Swap affect the players, not the monsters. And speaking of that, we also have Share the Pain, which will basically do the same as Creature Swap, but in a little bit of a different way. Instead of trading the monsters, both players will tribute one monster they control. These are very powerful cards, but they backfire in a way that sometimes you actually lose a lot more than gain by using these cards, because this card you will always go negative by 1, but sometimes they're just too important not to play. Moving on, we also have Offerings to Doom, just a quick play spell that gets rid of an opponent's monster on the field in exchange for your draw phase. But keep in mind this card is limited at 1 and you cannot play any limited one-off cards in the deck if you play this. Also, on the monster removal, we have the Hammer Shot, which is just a very funny card in my opinion. I love this card, I play it in a lot of decks because I think it's just really funny and it's actually quite competent. So it will always destroy the highest attack position monster on the field, and keep in mind, this can also blow up your monsters if you're not careful. Still, on the monster removal, we have Shield Crush. This basically says that you can destroy one defense position monster on the field, and Nobleman of Crossout, that banishes one face-down monster on the field, and if it's a flip effect, your opponent has to banish all copies of it in their deck, and you do as well. Moving on, Diffusion. This is the card that made me want to do this video, because I think Diffusion is a great card. And in this format, it's actually becoming pretty popular as well, because there's a lot of fusions going around, and this is basically an out to most of them. Stuff like the Fossil deck, you can actually just use this on them, and they won't bring any monsters back, they'll just lose their fusion. Stuff like in the Dynatank deck, you can just dodge stuff with Diffusion and go into an OTK to your opponent. So this card is just overall really strong, and that's the card that made me think of actually doing this video for you guys. Next, we have Book of Moon, just a generic staple. Most of you guys already know this card. It's great, it's insane, it's generic, very good. And Solitary Sword of Poison. This card has seen a lot of play in the past, and basically says that as long as you control one monster, the monster equipped with this card will have its attack doubled, and that is very strong in some cases. Next, we get into the Spell and Trap removal and control, and we have the Cosmic Cyclone. Not a great card overall, but some decks really love paying 1000 LP to do things they want to do. For example, the Cyberdark deck, which will allow you to use your skill, so this card is still worth considering and playing around. Sad thing is, this card is limited at 3, and I don't know why at this point, because it's not doing anything except for those very specific decks. Moving on, we have Night Beam, which is an amazing card still, and I would argue that Night Beam it's actually better than Mystical Space Typhoon in a lot of cases, because everyone and their mother are playing Mystical Space Typhoon, and no one is expecting Night Beam for most of the time, so playing this card is actually a great way to catch your opponent off guard in this format, in my opinion. Mystical Space Typhoon should be also here, it's just not because I don't have any copies available at the moment, but yeah, you should consider Cosmic, Night Beam, Mystical Space Typhoon and Galaxy Cyclone, because they're all great spell and trap removal. And finally, the last spell I'm showing you guys, it's Anti-Magic Arrows. Some decks just want to OTK without having the worry of your opponent's back row, and this is here just as a one-off way to, this turn, try to win the duel as quickly as possible. And this is all for the spells, and now we finally move on into the traps, and the first trap is Waking the Dragon. This card is a great way to scare your opponent off, because the mere existence of this card in speed duels makes your opponent think twice before popping any of your back row, as long as you're playing an extra deck. That's why in most decks you see people always play an extra deck, even though they do not play Waking the Dragon, just in the off chance that your opponent actually might think twice before popping your back row. Moving on. Mind Crush. This is all of my deck profile videos, guys. You guys already know Mind Crush. It's insane. Of course I would want to talk about it. Also, Straight Flush. This card has seen more play in the past, but it might see again in the future, because since there's only 3 zones, this card will work way more than it would normally in the TCG. And this card says that if your opponent controls a card in each of their spell and trap zones, you destroy all cards in their spell and trap zone. So this is basically an RP Feather Duster for the speed duel version. Moving on, we have Cursed Seal of the Forbidden Spell. This card is insane if you're playing a deck that has a lot of spell cards. And so this basically says that you negate one of their spell cards by discarding one of your own, and the spell cards you negated will basically be unusable for the rest of this duel, because your opponent cannot activate any spell with the same name of it. So this is an incredible card in my opinion against some specific decks. Moving on, we have Dust Tornado. This card is just spell trap removal like the other spells I've showed in the past, and it's still good. The spells in my opinion are better, but this is still a card worth considering, and it's actually a cheaper or an alternative version if you do not have the spells that destroy spell and trap cards. Moving on, Widespread Ruin and Sakuretsu Armor. These both do basically the same, but in my honest opinion, I think that Widespread Ruin is actually better, because even though you only get to destroy the highest attack monster on the field, unlike Sakuretsu Armor, Widespread Ruin does not target the monster you're destroying. So that little difference, I think it will actually come up in some scenarios, for example against Cyber Angel Izana and her target protection effect. Moving on, we have Divine Wrath. This card just came out in the midterm destruction box, and I think it has potential. It's not seeing much play right now, but I do believe this card will be heavily played in the future at some point at least. Moving on, we have Zero Gravity and Windstorm of Aqua. These basically do the same, except that Zero Gravity will change the battle position of all monsters on the field, and Windstorm of Aqua will only change the monsters your opponent controls. But cards that are able to change the monsters' battle positions, I believe, are actually still very good cards in this format, especially in some decks that you want to make use of your opponent's battle positions. So, for example, in decks like the Roids, you play Drill Roid, and these cards combo greatly with that deck. Moving on, we have Skill Successor. This is just basically a trap with double effects, once on the field and once by banishing itself from the graveyard, and the first time it will increase the monster by 400 points, and then you can banish this from the graveyard on a different turn and give one monster 800 attack points. And I like this card a lot because if you mill it, it will still have use in the graveyard, and they most of the times might not be expecting you to banish this card from the graveyard during the damage step and making your monster bigger than their own, thus winning you that battle and putting you in a very advantageous position. And next we have Wall of Disruption. This card will reduce the attack of all attack position monsters your opponent controls based on how many monsters they control. So the more monsters they control, the heavier the attack drop will be, making this for a very good card, and it's a limited 3 of card because of that. Moving on, one of the greatest cards in Speedball right now, in my opinion, it's Lost Wind. Has been good in the past, it's great right now. This card is insane in a format that there's a lot of special summoning, because this is basically an infinite impermanence for the TCG, and it actually sets itself. If your opponent is playing a deck that summons a lot from the extra deck, you will make maximum use of this card, making it for an insane card right now. And guys, speaking of insane cards, we also have Floodgate Trap Hole, because in a format like this, when there's only 3 monster zones, a card that will permanently flip face down one of your opponent's monsters, it has to be insane, and it is. Because basically guys, you will turn off one of their monster zones for a long period of time, giving you some time to get back on your feet if you're behind, or actually take control of the game if you're starting to get ahead. Moving on. Still on the one-off limited cards, we have Nightmare Wheel. This card has been played heavily since its inception. It's basically a burn card that doesn't allow the opponent's equipped monster to attack or change the battle position, making this for a very good card, but the fact that it got limited to 1 makes it see way less play and only mostly being played on burn decks. Speaking of burn as well, and limited to 1, we still have Zoma the Spirit, which is an insane card, guys. This card will inflict the attack of the monster that destroyed it by battle and sent to the graveyard to your opponent's life points, and in a format where there's only 4000 life points, this effect is actually pretty strong. And guys, the only reason you're not seeing as much play of Zoma the Spirit right now, it's because this card is also limited to 1, and there's only so much cards that we can choose to play limited to 1. Moving on, we play Woboku. This card is insane in my opinion. I love this card, it's a personal favorite. It's very good, gives you a lot of time, protects your monsters and your life points, and gives you the time you need in order to make your plays and survive a little bit longer in a duel, in that you may be waiting for a special card to turn it over. So this card buys you the time you basically need in order to start popping off with your own combos. And finally, the last card I'm showing you guys, it's Jar of Avarice. This card has seen play ever since its inception. It's not heavily played, but I think it has its place in some kinds of decks, especially decks that need to recycle a little bit of their cards during a grind game, and since Speedball decks are a lot smaller than the TCG ones, this card can actually make for a different win condition, which is deck out. During a heavily tied game state, when your opponent might be thinking that you will deck out first, if you flip this card up and recycle back 5 cards and just draw 1, you might get that card advantage in your deck that you need in order to actually deck your opponent out first instead of you. So this is still a very interesting card to play in some decks. And guys, this is all for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys did, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, because videos like this are not something that I usually would do, but I think it's interesting to let you guys know and maybe get you guys some ideas to change your decks around a little bit, and maybe even let you help build your decks just a little bit better. And guys, if you have some cards that you actually think that I should have talked about in this video, feel free to let me know in the comments, and that way we will help each other out in that way. So yeah guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of video. It's a little bit different, but I still enjoyed making it for you guys. And I hope you guys got some new ideas on how to build your decks and what cards you can actually make use of in your deck that you're thinking of building or that you are having trouble building in this moment. And yeah, guys, I hope I helped you out, and I hope you guys have some ideas for me as well in the comments. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and like always, this is LockYGO, and I'll see you on the next video. Out!